Silas Thorne believed that the color white was the ultimate mark of a gentleman. In the sweltering heat of Charleston, South Carolina in 1846, white wasn't just a color, it was a statement. It meant you had the money to keep things clean in a world of mud and sweat. It meant you were above the grime of the earth. Silas wanted his master bedroom to be the brightest, purest white in the entire South. He wanted the walls to glow like polished bone. But what Silas didn't know was that every stroke of the brush was a signature on his own death warrant. He thought he was building a sanctuary, but he was actually commissioning a tomb. And the man holding the brush was the only person who knew exactly how much that white paint truly cost. Elias was a man of few words and steady hands. At 45, his back was a map of the trials he'd endured, but his mind was a library of chemistry and craft. He was the most skilled painter in the county, a man who understood the secrets of minerals, oils, and pigments. He knew how to make a wall look like silk and how to make wood look like marble. For years, Elias had worked under the heavy thumb of Silas Thorne, a man who'd clawed his way into the Charleston elite through deception and blood. Silas was a social climber, a man obsessed with appearances because he knew how ugly his reality really was. The Thorne estate sat on the edge of the marshes, a grand house that smelled of salt air and decaying vegetation. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of turpentine and linseed oil. Silas was in the middle of a massive renovation, desperate to impress the local judges and governors. He had promised Elias something that no amount of money could buy. He had promised him his freedom. For 3 years, Elias had worked extra hours, saved every scrap of praise, and followed every order, all for a single sheet of paper, a signed manumission document that would let him and his teenage son Caleb walk away from the Thorne plantation forever. But Silas Thorne was a man who lived by the lie. He didn't just break promises, he incinerated them. It happened on a Tuesday. The humidity was so high you could feel the weight of the air on your chest. Elias had just finished prepping the master bedroom, stripping away layers of old peeling wallpaper to reveal the raw wood beneath. He went to Silas's study to report his progress, expecting to see the manumission papers signed and ready. Instead, he saw Silas standing by the fireplace. The master didn't even look at him. He just tossed a piece of parchment into the embers. Elias watched as his name and the word free curled into black ash. Silas turned around, his eyes cold and devoid of any guilt. He told Elias that he'd had an expensive month. He had ordered a set of mahogany furniture from Italy and a crystal chandelier from France. To pay for the grandeur of his new bedroom, he had sold Caleb to a trader headed for the deep south. The boy was gone before the sun had even fully risen. Silas didn't offer an apology. He offered a threat. He told Elias that if the master bedroom wasn't finished to perfection within the month, Elias would follow his son into the fields of Louisiana. In that moment, something inside Elias didn't break, it solidified. The grief for his son turned into a cold, calculated substance, much like the minerals he worked with every day. He didn't cry, he didn't beg, he simply bowed his head and returned to the master bedroom. But he wasn't a craftsman anymore, he was a chemist of vengeance. As Elias began the process of preparing the final coats of paint, he started with the waist coating. He was using a heavy iron chisel to pry back a loose piece of molding near the floorboards. The wood groaned and gave way, revealing a dark, dusty cavity in the wall. Elias expected to find nothing but cobwebs and dead insects. Instead, his fingers brushed against something solid. He reached in and pulled out a leather-bound ledger. The cover was stained with something dark and old, blood that had turned the color of rust over the years. Elias opened it and realized he was holding the evidence of Silas Thorne's greatest sin. 5 years ago, Silas had a business partner named Marcus Vane. Vane had disappeared, and Silas had claimed the entire estate for himself, telling the authorities that Vane had simply ran off with the company's gold. But the ledger told a different story. It was a partnership agreement, and the last pages were covered in frantic, jagged handwriting describing how Silas had been embezzling funds. The blood on the pages suggested that Vane hadn't run away. He had been silenced right here in this room. Elias realized that the very room he was painting was a crime scene. Silas had hidden the proof behind the walls, thinking that no one would ever look. He was so confident in his power that he had literally built his life on top of a murder. Elias tucked the ledger into a hidden pocket in his heavy work apron. He knew he couldn't just take it to the sheriff. A black man's word against Silas Thorne was worth nothing, even with the blood-stained book. He needed Silas to be weak. He needed the man's mind and body to fail so that the truth could finally breathe. That was when Elias looked at the jars of white lead. In the 1840s, flake white was the gold standard for paint. It was made of lead carbonate, and it produced a brilliant, opaque finish that stayed white for decades. Every painter knew it was dangerous. They knew the painter's colic, the stomach cramps, the trembling hands, the slow loss of strength that came from breathing the dust and handling the paste. Most painters took precautions. They wore masks, they washed their hands, they worked in ventilated rooms. Elias decided he would do the opposite. He would make this the most toxic room in the South. He began to mix the paint in large ceramic vats. Usually, you would cut the lead with enough oil and turpentine to make it safe to handle. Elias didn't do that. He began adding extra minerals he'd gathered from the storage shed, heavy concentrations of lead acetate, which had a strangely sweet smell. He used his primary tool, a heavy silver stirring rod. It was a beautiful, weighted piece of metal that Elias had used for 20 years. As he stirred the thick white sludge, the rod would scrape against the sides of the vat, leaving a faint gray residue. That residue was pure, concentrated lead. Silas Thorne would come into the room every evening to inspect the work. He would walk around, touching the walls, leaning in close to see the smoothness of the finish. He would stand in the center of the room and take deep breaths, admiring the clean smell of the fresh renovation. He didn't notice that Elias had sealed the windows from the outside under the guise of protecting the paint. In reality, he was creating a vacuum. He was trapping the toxic fumes inside, ensuring that every time Silas slept, he was marinating in a cloud of lead. By the end of the first week, the first coat was on the walls. The room looked spectacular. It was a blinding, clinical white that hurt the eyes if you looked at it long enough. But the air in the room felt heavy. It felt metallic. Sarah, the housemaid, was the only one who noticed Elias's strange behavior. She was a woman who saw everything and said very little. She saw Elias mixing the paint with a feverish intensity, adding jars of powder that weren't part of the standard recipe. She saw him wearing the wet cloth over his face, even when the windows were supposedly open. One night, while Silas was downstairs drinking his expensive bourbon, Sarah slipped into the room. "You're doing something to this air, Elias," she whispered, her eyes wide as she looked at the vats. "It tastes like pennies in my mouth just standing here." Elias didn't look up from his work. "The master wants a room that shines, Sarah, and I am going to give him a finish that will last until the day they put him in the ground." That's what Elias told her, his face covered by a thick, wet cloth. He didn't stop stirring. The silver rod scraped against the ceramic, a rhythmic, grating sound that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Sarah looked at the walls. They were so white they seemed to vibrate in the dim light of the lanterns. But she could feel it too, a heaviness in her chest, a metallic tang on the back of her tongue that no amount of water could wash away. She backed out of the room, leaving Elias alone with his minerals and his ghost of a son. But what Silas Thorne didn't know was that his vanity had already begun to eat him from the inside out. He spent his days in the town square, bragging about his new Italian furniture and the purity of his master bedroom. He walked with his head high, a man who thought he had successfully buried his past behind a fresh coat of paint. But the symptoms started small. It began with a bitter taste during his morning coffee. He blamed the kitchen staff, screaming that the beans were burnt or the water was foul. Then came the irritability. Silas was always a cruel man, but now his temper was like a dry forest waiting for a spark. He would fly into a rage over a misplaced spoon or a speck of dust on his boots. It was the lead. The fine, invisible dust was settling into his clothes, his hair, and his skin. And because Elias had sealed the windows from the outside, under the guise of protecting the paint, Silas was breathing in a concentrated dose of poison every time he stepped into that room to admire himself. By the second week, the physical pain arrived. It started as a dull ache in his abdomen, a cramping that made him double over when he thought no one was looking. He called it a touch of the vein. Like a wet rag, Silas began to suspect the cook, a woman named Martha, who had worked for the Thorne family for 20 years. He accused her of putting ground glass in his stew. He had her whipped in the yard, watching from the porch while clutching his stomach. His face a sickly shade of yellow that contrasted sharply with his bleached white linen shirt. Elias watched the whipping from the window of the master bedroom. He didn't flinch, he just kept painting. Every lash that fell on Martha's back was another reason to add more lead to the next batch of pigment. He was no longer just painting a room, he was constructing a weapon. He had moved on to the second coat, a mixture so thick with lead carbonate that it felt like he was spreading liquid stone. He used the silver stirring rod to ensure every ounce of the toxic powder was fully integrated. The rod was turning a dull, dark gray, the metal reacting to the chemicals. Elias knew that the same gray color was beginning to form a thin, ghostly line along Silas Thorne's gums. The lead line, a mark of the terminal. But the problem was the ledger. Elias still had the blood-stained book hidden in the pocket of his apron. He knew that if he was searched, it would be his death sentence. Silas was becoming increasingly paranoid, searching the rooms of the house staff, looking for the poison he was sure they were hiding. One night, Silas burst into the master bedroom, his eyes bloodshot and his hands trembling. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week. "Where is it, Elias?" Silas hissed, his voice cracking. He was leaning against the doorframe, his legs looking weak beneath him. Elias didn't stop his brushstroke. "Where is what, Master Silas?" "The filth, the rot, I can smell it in this house," Silas roared, though the effort made him wince and grab his side. "Someone is trying to undermine me. I can feel the treachery in the air. This room, it's the only place that feels clean, the only place that's pure." He staggered toward the wall and pressed his palm against the fresh paint. It was still tacky, a thick layer of white death. Silas closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against the wall. He was literally inhaling the very thing that was paralyzing his bowels and frying his nerves. Elias watched him, a cold satisfaction settling in his chest. He realized that Silas didn't just want a white room. He wanted a world where he could wipe away his crimes as easily as a smudge on a wall. "The paint is nearly dry, Master," Elias said quietly. "Once it sets, nothing from the old world will ever come through again. Your secrets are safe behind these walls." Silas looked at him, a flicker of suspicion crossing his face, but the pain in his gut returned with a vengeance, a sudden spasm that sent him to his knees. He vomited a dark bile liquid onto the floor, right onto the spot where Elias had found the hidden ledger. Elias didn't move to help him. He just watched as the man who had sold his son crawled toward the door, gasping for air that was saturated with lead. That night, Silas made a decision that would accelerate his downfall. He called for the sheriff and the local physician, Dr. Aris. He didn't call them to report a crime. He called them to witness his triumph. He wanted to show off the completed room, even though he could barely stand. But more importantly, he ordered that the master bedroom be completely sealed at night. He told the staff to heavy curtain the door and keep the windows bolted. He claimed the night miasma from the marshes was what was making him sick. He believed that by locking himself inside that brilliant white box, he would be safe. He was locking himself in a gas chamber. The turning point came when Dr. Eris arrived. Eris was a man of science, a quiet observer who didn't care much for the social posturing of men like Silas Thorne. When he entered the house, he immediately noticed the smell. It wasn't just the turpentine, it was that cloying artificial sweetness. He watched Silas try to play the host, offering the sheriff a glass of expensive brandy. But Silas's hands were shaking so violently that the crystal glass clattered against the decanter. "You're not well, Silas," Dr. Eris said, his eyes fixed on the man's trembling fingers. "Your color is off, and your gait, you're dragging your left foot." "It's nothing," Silas snapped, though he had to grip the back of a chair to stay upright. "The renovation has been taxing, but look at the room, doctor. Look at what I've built." He led them upstairs, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. When they reached the master bedroom, the sheriff let out a low whistle. The room was blinding. The white paint seemed to generate its own light, reflecting the lanterns in a way that made the walls look like they were glowing. It was a masterpiece of craftsmanship. But Dr. Eris didn't look at the walls. He looked at Elias, who was standing in the corner, his face masked by the wet cloth, his eyes steady and unreadable. And then it happened. Silas tried to take a step toward the center of the room to make a grand gesture, but his legs simply gave out. He didn't just stumble, he collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut. He hit the floor hard, his head narrowly missing the edge of a mahogany nightstand. The sheriff rushed to help him, but as they lifted him, Silas began to convulse. His body went rigid, his back arching, and a terrifying high-pitched wheeze escaped his throat. "Get him to the bed," the sheriff shouted. As they laid him, Silas's mouth fell open. Dr. Eris leaned in, holding a candle close to the man's face. He pulled back Silas's lip, looking for signs of a stroke or a fever. What he saw made him freeze. There, along the base of the teeth, was a distinct dark gray line. It looked like a bruise, but it was too perfectly formed. Eris shifted his gaze to the walls, then to the mixing vats in the corner, and finally to the silver stirring rod resting on the workbench. The rod was turning a dull, dark gray, the metal reacting to the chemicals. Elias knew that the same gray color was beginning to form a thin, ghostly line along Silas Thorne's gums. The lead line, a mark of the terminal. But the problem was the ledger. Elias still had the blood-stained book hidden in the pocket of his apron. He knew that if he was searched, it would be his death sentence. Silas was becoming increasingly paranoid, searching the rooms of the house staff, looking for the poison he was sure they were hiding. One night, Silas burst into the master bedroom, his eyes bloodshot and his hands trembling. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week. "Where is it, Elias?" Silas hissed, his voice cracking. He was leaning against the doorframe, his legs looking weak beneath him. Elias didn't stop his brushstroke. "Where is what, Master Silas?" "The filth, the rot, I can smell it in this house," Silas roared, though the effort made him wince and grab his side. "Someone is trying to undermine me. I can feel the treachery in the air. This room, it's the only place that feels clean, the only place that's pure." He staggered toward the wall and pressed his palm against the fresh paint. It was still tacky, a thick layer of white death. Silas closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against the wall. He was literally inhaling the very thing that was paralyzing his bowels and frying his nerves. Elias watched him, a cold satisfaction settling in his chest. He realized that Silas didn't just want a white room. He wanted a world where he could wipe away his crimes as easily as a smudge on a wall. "The paint is nearly dry, Master," Elias said quietly. "Once it sets, nothing from the old world will ever come through again. Your secrets are safe behind these walls." Silas looked at him, a flicker of suspicion crossing his face, but the pain in his gut returned with a vengeance, a sudden spasm that sent him to his knees. He vomited a dark bile liquid onto the floor, right onto the spot where Elias had found the hidden ledger. Elias didn't move to help him. He just watched as the man who had sold his son crawled toward the door, gasping for air that was saturated with lead. That night, Silas made a decision that would accelerate his downfall. He called for the sheriff and the local physician, Dr. Aris. He didn't call them to report a crime. He called them to witness his triumph. He wanted to show off the completed room, even though he could barely stand. But more importantly, he ordered that the master bedroom be completely sealed at night. He told the staff to heavy curtain the door and keep the windows bolted. He claimed the night miasma from the marshes was what was making him sick. He believed that by locking himself inside that brilliant white box, he would be safe. He was locking himself in a gas chamber. The turning point came when Dr. Aris arrived. Aris was a man of science, a quiet observer who didn't care much for the social posturing of men like Silas Thorne. When he entered the house, he immediately noticed the smell. It wasn't just the turpentine, it was that cloying artificial sweetness. He watched Silas try to play the host, offering the sheriff a glass of expensive brandy. But Silas's hands were shaking so violently that the crystal glass clattered against the decanter. "You're not well, Silas," Dr. Aris said, his eyes fixed on the man's trembling fingers. "Your color is off, and your gait, you're dragging your left foot." "It's nothing," Silas snapped, though he had to grip the back of a chair to stay upright. "The renovation has been taxing, but look at the room, doctor. Look at what I've built." He led them upstairs, his movements jerked. Man who had supposedly vanished with a fortune, leaving Silas Thorne to pick up the pieces of their broken partnership. The sheriff flipped through the pages, his face turning a hard, stony gray as he read the frantic entries. The numbers didn't lie. The dates of the embezzled funds matched the exact weeks before Vane disappeared, and the blood, thick, dark smears that had soaked through the parchment, was a silent scream from 5 years ago. But what the sheriff didn't see was the trap Elias had built around them. The room was still sealed, the lanterns were burning low, consuming what little clean air was left. The smell of the lead-heavy paint was so thick you could almost chew it. Dr. Aris was the first to realize the danger. He began to cough, a dry, hacking sound that rattled his ribs. He grabbed a handkerchief and pressed it to his mouth, his eyes darting from Silas to the walls. He knew what was happening. He understood that every minute they spent in this perfect room, they were taking in the same poison that was currently shutting down Silas Thorne's organs. "Sheriff, we need to move him," Aris wheezed, his voice sounding thin. "The air, it's toxic. We're all breathing it." "Not until I get the truth," Miller barked, though he too was starting to feel a dull throb behind his eyes. He stepped closer to the bed, leaning over Silas. "Thorne, look at me. Is this Vane's blood? Did you kill him in this house?" Silas made a sound like a wet bellows, his hand still twisted into that useless claw scraped against the silk sheets. He was trying to point, not at the ledger, not at the sheriff. He was pointing at the wall Elias had just opened. His mind, fractured by the lead and the guilt, was seeing things that weren't there. In his delirium, the white paint was melting. He saw the face of Marcus Vane forming in the pigment, a pale, ghostly figure rising out of the very masonry Silas had paid a fortune to beautify. He's under the floor," Silas gasped, the words forced out through a locked jaw. "The partner didn't run. He's in the foundation. The white, it was supposed to cover the smell. It was supposed to hide the shadow." The sheriff froze. The room went so quiet you could hear the wax dripping from the candles. Silas had just confessed to a capital murder in front of the law and the help. But the confession came with a price. Silas began to laugh, a horrible bubbling sound that turned into a spray of dark fluid from his lungs. He looked at Elias, his eyes suddenly clear for one terrifying second. "You think you've won, Painter," Silas whispered, a cruel smile stretching his bluish lips. "You found the book, you found the hair, but you'll never find the boy. I didn't sell him to a traitor. I gave him to the man who helped me bury Vane. He's at the Blackwood Forge 20 miles into the swamp, and he has orders. If I don't send word by Sunday, the boy goes into the furnace." The words hit Elias harder than any whip ever could. Sunday. That was only 2 days away. Silas had built a dead man switch. He had ensured that his own survival was tied to Caleb's fate. If Silas died now, if the lead finished its work before a message could be sent, Caleb was a dead man. The revenge Elias had spent weeks carefully mixing into the paint was suddenly a noose around his own son's neck. The problem was Silas's condition. Dr. Aris stepped forward, checking Silas's pulse. It was thready, skipping beats like a failing engine. "His heart is giving out, Sheriff. The lead has reached his brain. He's in the middle of a massive systemic collapse. If we don't get him out of this room and start purging his blood, he won't last the hour." "Then save him," Elias shouted, dropping the mask of the silent servant. He grabbed the doctor by the shoulders, his fingers digging into the man's coat. "You have to keep him alive. He has to tell the sheriff to release the boy." The sheriff looked at Elias, his suspicion finally boiling over. He looked at the silver stirring rod on the table. He looked at the way Elias was breathing through a wet cloth while the rest of them were choking. He wasn't a fool. He knew that the painter's colic didn't usually hit a master of the house this fast or this hard. He saw the calculated way the windows had been sealed. "You did this," Miller said, drawing his own pistol and aiming it at Elias's chest. "You poisoned him. You used the paint to kill him slowly." "I used the paint to make him tell the truth," Elias countered, his voice steady, even with a gun pointed at his heart. "He sold my son to pay for this room. He murdered his partner to build this house. I didn't give him the poison, Sheriff. He bought it himself. He demanded the brightest white. He demanded the lead. I just gave him exactly what he asked for." The tension in the room was a physical weight. The doctor was trying to stabilize a dying murderer. The sheriff was holding a gun on a man who had committed a crime of chemistry to avenge a crime of blood. And all around them, the white walls glowed, reflecting the madness of the situation. The air was becoming unbearable. The sheriff's hand was shaking, not from fear, but from the first stages of lead exposure. His vision was blurring. "If you kill me," Elias said, stepping closer to the barrel of the gun, "you'll never find the Blackwood Forge in time. You'll never find where Vane is buried, and you'll let a murderer die a hero in his own bed. Give me the keys to the stable. Let me go get my son. You stay here with the doctor. If Silas dies, you can hang me when I get back. But if you let my son die because of your pride, then you're no better than the man in that bed." Sheriff Miller looked at Silas, who was now unconscious, his breathing shallow and rattling. He looked at the blood-stained ledger, the evidence he needed to finally close the Vane case and secure his own reputation. He knew that if he arrested Elias now, the whole story would come out, including the fact that the sheriff had missed a murder right under his nose for 5 years. But if Elias disappeared, the sheriff could claim he discovered the ledger himself during a routine inspection. It was a corrupt bargain in a corrupt world. The sheriff lowered the gun. He reached into his pocket and tossed a heavy brass key on the floor. "Take the black horse," Miller spat, his face twisted in disgust. "If you're not back by dawn on Monday, I'll put a bounty on your head that will reach all the way to Canada. And Elias, if that boy is dead when you get there, don't bother coming back. I'll burn this house to the ground with you inside it." Elias didn't wait for another word. He scooped up the lock of Caleb's hair and the silver stirring rod. He needed the rod. It was the only thing that could prove the concentration of the poison if he ever had to defend himself in a real court. He turned and ran from the room, leaving the toxic beauty of the master bedroom behind. As he descended the stairs, he saw Sarah standing in the foyer. She had a small bundle of food and a canteen of water ready. She didn't ask questions. She had heard the shouting, heard the confession. She knew that the sleeping death Elias had mixed into the walls was finally waking up. "Go," Sarah whispered. "The horses are ready. But Elias, the master bedroom, the doctor says the air is still moving. It's spreading to the rest of the house. Elias paused at the door. He looked back at the grand staircase, at the mahogany and the silk, all of it built on a foundation of bones and covered in a layer of poison. Let it spread, Elias said. The whole house was built on a lie, Sarah. It's only right that the walls are the ones to tear it down. He burst out into the night air. It was humid and smelled of the marsh, but to Elias, it tasted like the purest wine. He swung himself onto the black horse, the animal sensing the urgency in his touch. The Blackwood Forge was deep in the cypress swamps, a place where the law didn't go, and where the heat of the furnaces was the only thing that could rival the summer sun. He had 20 miles of darkness ahead of him, and a man at the end of the trail who was waiting for a signal that would never come. But as he rode, Elias felt a cold realization settle in his gut. Silas Thorne was a paranoid man. He wouldn't have just left Caleb with a simple blacksmith. The Blackwood Forge was a front for something much darker. Silas mentioned the man who helped me bury Vane. That meant there was a second murderer out there, a man who knew exactly what happened 5 years ago and was just as invested in keeping the secret as Silas was. Elias reached into his pocket and felt the silver rod. It was heavy and cold. It had been his tool of labor for 20 years, and for the last month, it had been his tool of execution. Now it would have to be his weapon. Back in the mansion, the master bedroom was becoming a tomb. Dr. Eris was desperately trying to keep Silas alive, but the lead was relentless. It was in his marrow. It was in his brain. Silas opened his eyes one last time, looking at the ceiling. In his final hallucination, he didn't see the white paint. He saw the color of the ledger. He saw red. He tried to scream, but the lead had finally paralyzed his vocal cords. He died in total silence, surrounded by the most expensive, most beautiful, most lethal walls in South Carolina. The master was gone, but for Elias, the real battle was just beginning. The trail to the forge was narrow and overgrown, the Spanish moss hanging like shrouds from the trees. Every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot. Elias knew he was being watched. Silas Thorne's influence didn't end at the property line. The man who helped bury Vane was out there, and he was likely wondering why no messenger had arrived from the Thorne estate. Elias pushed the horse harder, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had to reach Caleb before the sun came up. He had to prove that the chemistry of justice could do more than just kill. It could also save. But as he rounded a bend in the trail, he saw a flickering orange glow in the distance. The furnaces were already lit. The smell of coal and hot iron filled the air, and standing in the middle of the path, "Silas doesn't send messengers like you," Bram said, his voice a low rumble that competed with the roar of the fire. "He sends men with papers and gold. You've got paint on your hands and a look in your eyes that says you've been where you don't belong." Elias slid off the horse, his boots sinking into the black mud. He didn't have a pistol. He didn't have a knife. All he had was the silver stirring rod clutched tight in his right hand. The metal felt cold despite the heat of the forge. He knew he couldn't outmuscle a man like Bram. He had to outthink him. He had to use the same precision he used when mixing a delicate glaze. "Silas Thorne is dying, Bram," Elias said, his voice cutting through the humid air. "He's in his big white room choking on his own blood. The sheriff is there, the doctor is there, and they found the ledger. They found Marcus Vane's blood under the paint." Bram's expression didn't change, but his grip on the sledgehammer tightened. The mention of Vane was a trigger. If Silas is talking, then Silas is a fool. But dead men don't testify, and neither do painters who get lost in the swamp. "I'm not here to testify," Elias said, taking a step forward. "I'm here for my son. Silas told me you have him. He told me the order was to put him in the furnace if the word didn't come by Sunday. Well, I'm the word, and the word is that the game is over." Bram laughed, a dry, hacking sound. He pointed the head of the sledgehammer toward a small, iron-reinforced shed near the back of the forge. "The boy is in there. He's been useful, keeps the bellows moving. But Silas pays for silence, and you're bringing a lot of noise. I think I'll just throw you both in the furnace and tell Silas the marsh took you." Bram swung the sledgehammer with a terrifying speed. Elias ducked, the heavy iron head whistling just inches above his skull. He rolled in the mud, the heat of the forge singing the hair on his arms. He knew he only had one chance. Bram was used to fighting men who fought back with fists or blades. He wasn't prepared for a man who understood the weight and balance of a stirring rod. As Bram recovered for a second swing, Elias lunged. He didn't aim for the chest or the head. He aimed for the man's lead-heavy movements. He thrust the silver rod into the gap between Bram's ribs and his arm, using it as a lever. With a grunt of effort, Elias twisted the rod, catching the blacksmith's sleeve and throwing his balance off. Bram stumbled toward the edge of the cooling vat, a large stone basin filled with stagnant, oily water. Elias didn't stop. He used the momentum to strike Bram across the temple with the heavy silver end of the rod. It was a solid metallic thud. Bram gasped, his knees buckling. He hit the edge of the vat and tumbled backward into the water. The splash was massive, sending a cloud of steam into the air as the hot iron tools in the blacksmith's belt hissed in the cold liquid. Elias didn't wait to see if Bram would get up. He ran for the shed. He used the silver rod to wedge into the lock, prying with every ounce of strength he had left. The wood groaned, the iron bolt screamed, and then the door flew open. Inside, sitting in the dirt, was Caleb. The boy was covered in coal dust, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. He looked older, his face thinner, the light of his youth dimmed by the exhaustion and the heat. When he saw Elias, he didn't move at first. He thought it was a hallucination brought on by the exhaustion. "Father," he whispered, his voice cracked from the smoke. "I've got you, son," Elias said, reaching down and pulling the boy to his feet. "We're leaving right now." They didn't take the road. Elias knew the sheriff's promise was as thin as the paper Silas had burned. He led Caleb through the thickest parts of the swamp, using the silver rod to hack through the vines and the Spanish moss. They walked for hours, the sounds of the forge fading behind them. Elias didn't tell Caleb about the paint. He didn't tell him about the lead, or the way Silas Thorne had died. He just kept moving, his eyes fixed on the North Star whenever it peeked through the canopy of the trees. Back at the Thorne mansion, the dawn was breaking, but it didn't bring any light to the master bedroom. Silas Thorne was dead. He had died at 3:14 a.m., his body a rigid statue of agony. Dr. Aris had already left, his own lungs burning from the hours he spent in the room. He had seen enough. He knew that the white heaven Silas had built was a monument to a murderer, and he had no intention of helping the sheriff cover it up. Sheriff Miller stood in the center of the room, looking at the floorboards Elias had pried open. He had called in 2 deputies to lift the heavy oak planks. Beneath them, wrapped in a rotting tarp, was what was left of Marcus Vane. The body had been preserved by the salt air and the lack of oxygen, his face still twisted in the surprise of his final moment. The ledger was in the sheriff's hand, a solid piece of evidence that would ensure Silas Thorne's name would be dragged through the mud for generations. But the sheriff was also looking at the walls. In the morning light, the white paint was beginning to crack. The sheer volume of lead Elias had used made the paint too heavy for the wood. It was peeling away in long, jagged strips, revealing the dark, stained history of the house beneath it. The room was literally shedding its skin. "What do we do about the painter, Sheriff?" one of the deputies asked, looking at the empty stable. Miller looked out the window. He saw the black horse returning, riderless and lathered in sweat. He knew Elias wasn't coming back. He knew that if he sent a posse, he'd have to explain how a slave had managed to execute a master right under the nose of the law. He'd have to explain the ledger, the body, and the silver rod. It was a mess that would ruin his career. "The painter is dead," Miller said, his voice flat. "He must have drowned in the marsh trying to escape. Write it in the report. Silas Thorne was murdered by his business partner years ago, and the guilt finally drove him to a stroke. The house is a crime scene. Seal it up." The sheriff walked out, taking the ledger with him. He would eventually give it to Marcus Vane's family, who lived in Philadelphia. They would come down with a team of lawyers and claim the entire Thorne estate as restitution. They would find Sarah and the rest of the house staff, and out of gratitude for the truth coming out, they would grant them their formal manumission. The Thorn plantation would cease to exist, its lands broken up and its grand house left to rot in the salt air. Years later, a traveler passing through the marshes of South Carolina might see the ruins of a great mansion. The roof had caved in and the vines had reclaimed the porch. But if you walked into the master bedroom, you would still see patches of that brilliant, blinding white paint clinging to the walls. It was a white that never yellowed, a white that never faded. It stood as a silent warning to anyone who thought they could build a life on the suffering of others. Elias and Caleb made it to the Ohio River 3 months later. They traveled by night and slept by day, aided by a network of people who saw the lead line on Elias's hands and knew he had paid a heavy price for his freedom. Elias never painted again. His hands shook too much, a permanent reminder of the weeks he spent mixing the sleeping death. But he didn't need to paint. He found work as a chemist's assistant in a small town in Pennsylvania, using his knowledge of minerals to create medicines instead of poisons. Caleb grew up to be a teacher. He never knew the full extent of what his father had done in that white room, but he saw the silver stirring rod every day. Elias kept it on the mantel, polished and shining. It wasn't a tool anymore. It was a scepter. It was the physical proof that a man with nothing but a brush and a bowl could bring down a kingdom of cruelty. The walls you spend your fortune on are the only things that see what you did, and they've been telling the truth every day. Silas Thorne wanted the brightest white in the South, and in the end, that white was the only thing that stayed to watch him die. He thought he was buying power, but he was only buying a very expensive, very beautiful shroud. A man's greed builds a house, but his cruelty paints the walls. Justice isn't always found in a courtroom. Sometimes it's found in the very air you breathe and the very things you touch. Silas Thorne learned that too late, and his story remains a testament to the fact that you can never truly cover up the truth, not even with the purest paint in the world.